The air in the corner of the Astoria bedroom was thick with the scent of his life's work. The sharp, earthy smell of India ink, the dry, sweet perfume of aging Bristol board, and the faint, metallic tang of the cheap electric kettle he used for endless cups of black tea. Ben's world was confined to this 5-foot by 5-foot space, a universe he built with a worn-out drawing tablet and a collection of fine-tipped pens that were his most prized possessions. His back ached from hunching over the drafting table, a second-hand piece of furniture he'd found on the curb and lovingly restored, its surface scarred with the ghosts of 1,000 previous drawings. Outside the single window, the symphony of Queens played on, the distant rumble of the N train, the staccato shouts of kids playing street hockey, the mournful wail of a far-off ambulance. To him, these weren't distractions. They were the ambient soundtrack to creation. He was 35, and for the last decade, his entire being had been poured into The Crimson Compass, a sprawling sci-fi epic that lived more vividly in his mind than the city outside. The modest royalty checks and sporadic freelance gigs amounted to a meager $55 a year, a laughable sum in a city that measured a man's worth in square footage and stock options. Yet Ben felt a quiet, profound richness here. He believed, with the earnest naivety of a true artist, that he and Eleanor were a team. He was the dreamer, the foundation of their future home, while she was the builder, the one navigating the cutthroat world of Manhattan so that one day, his dreams could support them both. He saw his meager income not as a failure, but as an investment in a shared destiny, a down payment on a life they were building together. He was wrong, of course, but the truth had not yet found a reason to reveal itself. And in his ink-stained corner, he was, for a little while longer, content in the warmth of his delusion. He carefully wiped the nib of his pen, a ritual of precision and care, completely unaware that the partnership he cherished was a fiction he had authored all by himself. The rest of the apartment, the part that wasn't his creative sanctuary, belonged entirely to Eleanor. It was a sterile, curated space that felt less like a home and more like a showroom for a life he wasn't truly a part of. Where his corner was a chaos of paper, ink pots, and reference books, her domain was all sharp angles, cold glass, and neutral tones. The air itself seemed to change as you crossed the invisible threshold, the warm, organic smell of his work giving way to the faint, chemical scent of an expensive minimalist reed diffuser that smelled of white tea and bergamot. On a low, brutally modern bookshelf in the living room, a piece she'd ordered from a Scandinavian design catalog that cost more than his last 3 royalty checks combined, sat the physical manifestation of her disregard. It was a first-edition hardcover of The Crimson Compass, the culmination of a decade of his soul's labor. He had given it to her on their anniversary, his hands trembling slightly as she unwrapped it. Inside, on the title page, he had inscribed in his best calligraphic hand, "For Eleanor, my true north in every universe." He'd meant it with every fiber of his being. Now, that declaration of love and a lifetime of work sat half-hidden, its vibrant, hand-drawn cover obscured by the latest issue of The Economist. Placed there with a casual indifference that was more cutting than any insult, it wasn't just forgotten. It was actively suppressed, a piece of his identity deemed unworthy of display, a testament to her profound and complete disinterest in the man she shared a bed with. He often found his eyes drawn to it, a small, painful magnet in the corner of the room, and a cold knot would tighten in his gut. It was a constant, silent reminder that in her world of leveraged buyouts and hostile takeovers, his universe of starships and alien worlds was nothing more than a childish distraction. If you enjoy stories of karma, hidden secrets, and the quiet power of the underestimated, subscribe now to witness how the truth always finds a way to surface. The click of the deadbolt turning in the front door was a sound that always coiled a spring of low-grade anxiety in Ben's stomach. It was 8:00 p.m., her usual time. He quickly capped his ink bottle and wiped his hands on a rag, a subconscious effort to erase the evidence of his day's labor, to make himself seem less like the messy artist and more like a man who hadn't just spent 10 hours lost in a fantasy world. Eleanor entered not like someone coming home, but like a CEO conducting a surprise inspection. Her presence filled the small apartment, her expensive wool coat, smelling of the cold, clean air of Midtown, and a perfume so potent it seemed to colonize the space, making his ink and paper world shrink in its wake. She dropped her leather briefcase by the door with a heavy thud that sounded of importance and exhaustion. Her eyes, sharp and analytical, swept the room, cataloging every perceived imperfection. A stack of his research books on the floor, a mug left on the coffee table. "Still playing with your cartoons, I see," she said, her voice devoid of malice but dripping with a condescension so practiced it had become her default tone. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a verbal pat on the head for the charmingly unambitious man-child she had married. He felt the familiar heat rise in his cheeks, a flush of shame and frustration that he immediately swallowed down. He had learned long ago that defending his work was a futile exercise. To her, his passion wasn't a career. It was a cute hobby, a quaint little pastime that kept him occupied while she did the real work of earning a living. He would try to explain the intricacies of world building, the nuance of character arcs, the sheer discipline it took to create a 200-page graphic novel. But her eyes would glaze over, her attention already drifting to the stock market ticker on her phone. He was a social liability, a stain on the power couple image she so desperately curated for her colleagues and clients. He was the awkward, silent husband at her firm's holiday parties, the one whose profession was vaguely described as in publishing to avoid the embarrassing truth. And as she looked at him now, her expression a perfect mask of weary tolerance. He knew that in her mind, he was just another piece of furniture in the apartment that she paid for. The daily ritual of her condescension was a masterclass in subtle psychological warfare, a slow, steady erosion of his self-worth that was as methodical as her legal briefs. She never raised her voice. Her cruelty was always delivered with a veneer of sophisticated concern. "Did you remember to take the recycling out, honey? I know it's easy to lose track of time when you're in your creative bubble," she'd say, the emphasis on creative bubble making it sound like a padded room in a sanatorium. Or she would hold up a new purchase, a pair of $1,000 shoes, and say, "I treated myself today. M&A is a blood sport," a statement that simultaneously highlighted her success and his financial irrelevance. He would nod and offer a weak smile, the words, "I sold a commission today for $500, dying on his lips, knowing how pathetic it would sound in the face of her six-figure bonuses. The contrast between their lives was a chasm that grew wider with each passing day. Her world was one of mahogany boardrooms, of hushed negotiations where fortunes were made and lost with the stroke of a pen, of hushed calls about shell companies and forensic accounting. His was a world of paper cuts, of the satisfying scratch of a nib on paper, of the quiet triumph of getting a character's expression just right. He tried to bridge that chasm, to show an interest in her work, but it was a language he couldn't speak. When she talked about irrevocable deeds or non-disclosure agreements, his mind would drift back to the orbital mechanics of his fictional starships. He felt like a foreigner in his own home, and she was the exasperated native who had long given up trying to teach him the local dialect. The most painful moments were when she had guests over, other lawyers from her firm who radiated the same predatory ambition. He would be introduced, and there would be that polite, blank smile as they tried to comprehend what a graphic novelist did. He could feel Eleanor's embarrassment radiating off her like heat, and he would retreat into himself, becoming a silent ghost at his own dining table, nursing a beer while they discussed trust funds and alimony payments for their less fortunate friends. He knew she saw him not as her partner, but as her pro bono charity case, and that knowledge was a heavier burden than any financial struggle. But in the quiet hours after she had gone to sleep, a different world opened up to him. For the past few months, a secret correspondence had become his lifeline, a source of validation so potent it felt like a forbidden drug. It had started with a simple email, a message from a fan using the alias Ethelred. The name was an obscure reference from his own book, a detail so minor that only the most devoted reader would have noticed it. Ethelred's emails were different from the usual fan mail. They were not just complimentary, they were deeply, astonishingly insightful. This person didn't just read his work, they inhabited it. They wrote long, eloquent analyses of his thematic choices, his use of shadow and light, the subtle political allegories he had woven into the narrative. For the first time, Ben felt truly seen. He would sit in the dark, the only light in the apartment coming from the glow of his laptop screen, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and fear. This was a private joy, a conversation that belonged only to him. He guarded it fiercely, minimizing the screen whenever he heard Eleanor stir in the bedroom. Their exchanges grew more frequent, evolving from a discussion of the book to a deeper conversation about art, sacrifice, and the creative process. Ethelred understood the loneliness of the creator, the years of thankless work fueled by nothing but a burning internal vision. He felt a kinship with this anonymous stranger that he had never felt with his own wife. Ethelred spoke his language. He saw the value in what Ben did, not in terms of dollars and cents, but in the currency of imagination and human connection. This secret dialogue became his sanctuary, a place where he wasn't Eleanor's hobbyist husband, but the master of a universe, a creator worthy of respect. He had no idea who Ethelred was, picturing him as perhaps a literature professor or a fellow struggling artist, but the identity was less important than the feeling of profound understanding that flowed through their digital conversations. This connection was a quiet rebellion, a reclaiming of his own worth in the face of Eleanor's constant, casual dismissals. The digital glow of the laptop screen felt like a campfire in the vast, lonely darkness of his life. He would read and reread Ethelred's messages, dissecting every sentence, savoring the intellectual and emotional nourishment they provided. It was a stark contrast to his verbal interactions with Eleanor, which had become transactional and hollow. With her, he discussed bills, groceries, and her firm's latest corporate conquest. With Ethelred, he discussed the very nature of storytelling, the philosophical underpinnings of his character's motivations, and the struggle to render a complex idea into a single, perfect image. He found himself pouring more of his true self into these emails than he ever did into a conversation with his wife. He confessed his fears, that his best work was behind him, that he was a fraud, that he would die in obscurity. Ethelred would respond not with platitudes, but with sharp, incisive encouragement, quoting back lines from Ben's own work to illustrate a point, showing that he had not just read the book, but had absorbed it into his very DNA. The anonymity of it all was intoxicating. He was free to be the artist, the thinker, the dreamer, without the heavy cloak of Eleanor's judgment. He started to live a double life, the quiet, accommodating husband by day, and the celebrated author in conversation with his most ardent admirer by night. This secret world gave him a newfound strength. Eleanor's little barbs and dismissive comments still stung, but they no longer pierced his soul. He had a shield now, an invisible armor forged in the fires of Ethelred's respect. He started drawing with a renewed vigor, his lines more confident, his stories deeper and more complex. He was creating for himself again, and for the anonymous kindred spirit on the other side of the screen. The irony was not lost on him. He was having the most intimate and meaningful relationship of his life with a complete stranger, a ghost in the machine who understood him better than the woman who slept beside him every night. He felt a pang of guilt, but it was quickly overshadowed by the overwhelming sense of relief and belonging. He was no longer just an artist in a vacuum. He had an audience of one, and for now, that was more than enough. Then, the email that changed everything arrived. It hit his inbox at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, carrying an innocuous subject line, a proposition. Ben had been deep in the zone, sketching a difficult action sequence, his hand moving in a blur across the page. The notification ping barely registered until he saw the sender, Ethelred. He never ignored Ethelred. He clicked it open, eyes scanning the first lines with casual interest that almost immediately turned into wide-eyed disbelief. The tone was different, more formal, less fan, and more businessman. Ethelred apologized for the subterfuge of his anonymity and introduced himself. His name was Marcus Thorne. Ben's breath caught. It couldn't be. Not the Marcus Thorne, the legendary, reclusive film director, a cinematic genius who hadn't made a public appearance in over a decade, whose films were the gold standard of intelligent blockbuster science fiction. Thorne was Ben's idol, the director he'd fantasized about working with in the most impossible corners of his imagination. Ben read the name again, the letters shimmering on the screen like they didn't belong to his life. Thorne explained he'd been searching for his next project for years, something with depth and soul, and had stumbled onto The Crimson Compass in a small, independent bookstore. He'd become, in his own words, utterly obsessed. Then the email laid out a vision, a film franchise, a trilogy, with Ben heavily involved as a creative consultant and executive producer. Ben's hands began to shake, the tremor starting in his fingertips and climbing up his arms. His heart hammered against his ribs as he scrolled, hunting for the part his brain couldn't yet accept. The offer was there, plain as day, a total production and rights agreement. A number so vast it looked like a typo, $75 million. The figure detonated in the airless dark of his apartment. 75 million. He mouthed the words, but no sound came out. It was lottery money, corporate money, not money that belonged to a guy who bought art supplies on a credit card he prayed wouldn't get declined. He gripped the edge of his desk as vertigo rolled through him. The familiar reality of his cramped Astoria apartment suddenly feeling thin, unstable, like it could crack. He read the email again and again. The details were too precise, too intimate. Observations only Ethelred could make. It was real. And with that realization came something sharper than euphoria. Terror. This single message had the power to rewrite his entire existence. Career, finances, future. And it would irrevocably change his marriage. For a fleeting moment, a beautiful fantasy played out. He'd show Eleanor the email and watch her condescending smirk melt into stunned awe. He imagined her finally seeing him, truly seeing him. Not as her pet project, but as an equal. This deal wasn't just money. It was vindication. Proof that every late night and every dismissive comment had been wrong. Then a cold thought slithered in, quiet and lethal. What if she didn't see it as their victory, but as hers to claim? The night air, once a comforting blanket of city sounds, now felt thin and sharp in his lungs. Eleanor had glided onto the balcony, a silhouette of predatory grace against the glittering, indifferent skyline of Manhattan across the river. She thought he was asleep, lost in his ink-stained dreams. He wasn't. The glass door was ajar, just enough for her voice to slither through. A low, venomous whisper stripped of the weary tolerance she performed for him. It was a voice he had never heard before. Sharp and conspiratorial, laced with a triumphant cruelty that was utterly chilling. He could only catch fragments, words carried and torn by the breeze. But they were enough. Don't worry, darling. The endearment, so casually deployed to someone who wasn't him, was a physical blow. He's an artist. He doesn't understand term sheets. The condescension was pure, uncut, a distillation of every dismissive comment she had ever made. He felt the blood drain from his face, his body going cold, then hot with a shame so profound it felt like a fever. He gripped the doorframe, his knuckles white, the cheap paint cool and solid beneath his trembling fingers. The final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The cologne, the breakthrough, the lie about the obscure little graphic novel. It was all a performance, a prelude to the kill. And then he heard the final, gutting phrase, the words that would echo in his mind for the rest of his life. I'll have him sign the rights over to the firm's holding company. His little book will finally be worth something. In that moment, the man she had married died, and something else, something colder and far more patient, began to take his place. He retreated from the doorway on silent feet, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He slipped back into their bed, the sheets feeling alien and hostile against his skin. He lay there, perfectly still, his breathing shallow and even, a masterful impression of sleep. When Eleanor came back inside, sliding the glass door shut with a soft click, he felt the shift in the room's atmosphere. She moved with a quiet, satisfied confidence, the victor returning from the field. The faint, foreign scent of sandalwood and leather wafted from her clothes as she undressed, a ghostly reminder of her betrayal. He felt the mattress dip as she lay down beside him, her back to him, and the warmth radiating from her body felt like the heat from a funeral pyre. Sleep was an impossibility. His mind was a maelstrom, replaying her whispered words, each one a fresh incision. He's an artist. She said it like a diagnosis for a terminal, pitiful disease. For years, he had accepted her narrative, that he was the dreamer and she was the pragmatist, that their skills were complementary, that they were a team. It was a lie he had helped her construct, a beautiful, elaborate fiction he had desperately wanted to believe. Now he saw the truth. He wasn't her partner. He was an asset she was planning to strip. His art, his soul, his decade of work. It was all just a little book, a raw material for her to refine into a corporate victory. The grief was a physical thing, a crushing weight on his lungs. But beneath it, a new feeling was taking root. A cold, crystalline rage. The fantasy of their shared future had been incinerated, and from the ashes, a singular, clear purpose emerged. He needed proof. He needed to see the architecture of her treason, and he knew there was only one place to find it. He waited, listening to the rhythm of her breathing change, deepening from the shallow breaths of wakefulness into the slow, steady cadence of sleep. Each minute stretched into an eternity. The familiar sounds of the city outside, a distant siren, the rumble of a late-night train, were a soundtrack to his own silent internal countdown. He counted to 500, then started again, forcing a meditative calm over the frantic pounding of his heart. When he was certain she was deeply asleep, he began to move. The act of slipping out of bed, A simple motion he had performed thousands of times was now fraught with the tension of a bomb disposal. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his bare feet meeting the cold hardwood floor with a caution that bordered on reverence. He held his breath, listening for any change in her breathing, any sign that he had disturbed her. Nothing. He rose to his feet, a slow, fluid motion, his body coiled with a tension that made every muscle ache. The apartment, his home, was now enemy territory. Every familiar object was a potential source of noise, every shadow a potential hiding place for failure. His target was in the living room, sitting on the glass and steel desk she used for her work-from-home days, her laptop. It sat there, closed, a sleek, black rectangle of aluminum and glass, a vault containing the truth he so desperately needed. He crept out of the bedroom, his every step a calculated risk, the floorboards beneath him a minefield of creaks and groans he had never noticed before. He was a ghost in his own house, a thief stealing back his own life. The laptop felt cold and inert beneath his fingertips, a perfect, seamless object of engineering that seemed to mock the messy, organic chaos of his own creative life. He carried it from her desk to the worn armchair in the corner of the living room, angling himself so the screen's light wouldn't spill into the bedroom. He settled into the chair, the familiar sag of the cushions offering no comfort, and lifted the lid. The screen flared to life, its bright, clean light illuminating his face, making him feel naked and exposed in the darkness. A single blinking cursor in the password field pulsed like a heartbeat. The challenge was laid bare. To enter her world, he had to think like her. He started with the obvious, the passwords of a life they had supposedly shared. He typed Eleanor and Ben, his fingers moving with a clumsy, hesitant touch. Access denied. The red shake of the text box was a small, digital rejection. He tried their anniversary, 08142012. Access denied. He tried the name of the restaurant where he had proposed, the River Cafe. Access denied. With each failed attempt, a layer of his delusion was stripped away. The things that were keystones of his memory of them were nothing to her, not even worthy of a simple password. He felt a bitter, hollow ache in his chest. He had been trying to unlock her world with keys from his own, and they simply didn't fit. He leaned back, the frustration and grief threatening to overwhelm him, and then a cold clarity washed over him. It wouldn't be about them. It would be about her, her ambition, her next conquest. His fingers flew across the keyboard, typing a new combination, one born not of love, but of the ugly truth he had just learned. Thorn Acquisition 2. He was in. The feeling was not one of triumph, but of profound violation and dread. Her digital desktop was a mirror of her mind, efficient, cold, and compartmentalized. There were no personal photos, no cluttered files, just a neat grid of folders with names like Q3 projections, client onboarding, and SEC filings. It was the sterile landscape of a life he had only ever seen from a distance. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive silence. He felt like a trespasser, an intruder in the most private space of the woman he thought he knew. His eyes scanned the folder names, searching for anything that looked out of place, anything that might betray a personal agenda. His gaze landed on a folder titled, with a sickeningly corporate euphemism, Special Projects. He clicked it. Inside, there was a single subfolder, its name a punch to the gut, M. Thorn Initiative. His breath caught in his throat. He opened it. It was all there, a meticulously organized blueprint for her betrayal. There were call logs, research documents on Marcus Thorn's personal life, and a series of increasingly familiar flirtatious emails between her and the director. He scrolled through them, his stomach churning as he read her calculated charm, her promises of a seamless, artist-friendly transition. Then he found it, a file named Rights Transfer Agreement, Draft V3 Docs. He clicked it open, the document filling the screen with dense, impenetrable legalese. He scanned the clauses, his eyes searching for the fine print, and then he saw it. The agreement wasn't between Marcus Thorn and Benjamin Carver. It was between Thorn and a shell company, North Star Holdings LLC, a name that was a twisted, cynical mockery of the inscription in his book. His name was nowhere to be found, except for a single stark line at the very bottom, waiting for the signature that would legally and irrevocably steal his entire universe from him. The words on the screen were a foreign language written with familiar letters, a legal incantation designed to render him invisible. North Star Holdings LLC. The name was a deliberate, surgical strike, a piece of psychological warfare disguised as a corporate entity. He felt the air leave his lungs in a silent, ragged gasp, his vision tunneling until the only thing that existed was the glowing white document and the ghost of his own inscription. For Eleanor, my true north. She had taken the most vulnerable, heartfelt sentiment he had ever offered her and twisted it into a weapon, forging it into a legal shield behind which she could steal his soul. His mind, usually a vibrant landscape of starships and alien worlds, felt barren and cold, a vacuum where love and trust used to be. He scrolled through the document, his finger trembling on the trackpad. The clauses were dense, impenetrable walls of text, but he forced himself to read them, to understand the architecture of his own erasure. He saw phrases like, in perpetuity, all media, known and unknown, and irrevocable transfer of all intellectual property rights. He was not a partner in this agreement. He was a resource being liquidated. The document didn't just sell the rights to his book, it sold the rights to every character, every world, every idea he had ever had or would ever have related to his creation. It was a complete and total annexation of his entire creative existence. And at the very bottom, in a sea of corporate signatures and notary stamps, was the empty space reserved for him. Benjamin Carver, grantor. He wasn't even the artist or the author. He was the grantor, a legal term that stripped him of all identity, reducing him to a function, a final, necessary signature to facilitate his own execution. He realized with a sickening clarity that this contract wasn't a business deal. It was his own legally binding suicide note. He minimized the contract, the white of the page searing an afterimage onto his retinas, and clicked back to the folder. His movements were slow, robotic, his body operating on a primal instinct for survival while his mind was still reeling from the initial blast. He saw a subfolder labeled Comms MT, and his finger hovered over it before clicking, a grim acceptance settling in his bones. He needed to see the full scope of the wound. She was charming, witty, and deferential, positioning herself not as a lawyer, but as a fellow admirer of niche art. He saw her name drop obscure sci-fi authors, a clear sign she had done her research, faking a passion she had only ever met with disdain in her own home. As the correspondence continued, her tone shifted, becoming more intimate, more conspiratorial. He read messages where she described Ben with a kind of affectionate pity, painting him as a brilliant but naive creative who was overwhelmed by the business side of things. She was casting herself as his protector, the savvy shepherd who would guide his fragile genius through the treacherous world of Hollywood contracts. The hypocrisy was a physical poison, a bitter acid rising in his throat. This was the woman who called his work cartoons, who hid his book behind a magazine, now presenting herself to the world as his greatest champion. Then he found the email that made his blood run cold, a message from just last week where she assured Thorne, "Don't worry, I have a clear strategy for the final sign-off. He trusts me completely. It will be a simple matter of getting him to sign a few standard documents from the firm." A cold fire began to smolder in the pit of his stomach, burning away the shock and leaving behind something harder, something sharper. The grief was still there, a great hollow cavern in his chest, but now it was being filled with a cold, clear rage. He was not a victim of a simple betrayal. He was the target of a long con, a meticulously planned operation that had been in motion for months. He navigated back to the main folder and found another subfolder, this one clinically labeled Corporate Structure. Inside were the incorporation documents for North Star Holdings LLC. He opened the PDF, his eyes scanning the dry official forms from the Delaware Division of Corporations. The date of formation was stamped in the top right corner, 3 months ago. 3 months. Long before her triumphant return from the networking dinner. Long before she had ever mentioned a breakthrough with the Thorne Camp. This wasn't an opportunity she had seized. It was a conspiracy she had authored from the very beginning. He saw the listed address for the company, a post office box in Wilmington. He saw the name of the registered agent, a junior associate from her firm, a young man he'd met at a holiday party who had seemed terrified of Eleanor. It was a ghost corporation, a legal phantom created for the sole purpose of hiding the money, of laundering his life's work through a labyrinth of corporate law until it emerged, clean and untouchable, in an account he would never see. The term shell company, once a piece of abstract jargon he'd heard her use on phone calls, was now a visceral reality. It was a box designed to hold his future, and she had the only key. He found a draft of the financial flowchart, a document that laid out the distribution of the $75 million, and the rage inside him solidified into a diamond-hard point of focus. His creation was carved up into percentages: 40% for her firm, a 20% finder's fee for Eleanor herself, and the rest allocated to production costs and investor returns, with a small insulting footnote at the bottom. Annual stipend for B. Carver, $150, $1. The professional and the personal betrayals were two heads of the same monster, and he knew he had to look the other one in the eye. He remembered the cologne, the scent of sandalwood and leather that clung to her like a second skin that night. It was the scent of her victory, and he now realized, the scent of her lover. His fingers moved with a new, grim purpose, searching through her files, no longer a hesitant intruder, but a forensic investigator dissecting a crime scene. He found a folder buried deep within her personal drive, deceptively labeled Travel and Expenses. It wasn't filled with corporate receipts. It was a catalog of her affair. He saw a reservation for two at a boutique hotel in Big Sur, a place known for its seclusion and privacy, nestled near Marcus Thorne's infamous isolated estate. The dates matched a women's leadership conference she had supposedly attended in San Francisco 2 months prior. He saw restaurant receipts from Carmel for dinners that cost more than his monthly royalty checks, paid for with her corporate Amex. He saw an e-receipt from a high-end men's boutique for a bottle of cologne, the brand name confirming his suspicion with a sickening finality. She hadn't just been sleeping with Thorne. She had been using her firm's resources, and by extension the fruits of their shared life, to finance her infidelity. The realization was a gut punch, winding him, leaving him breathless. She was sleeping with his idol, using his own money to do it, all while plotting to steal the very work that had brought them together. He scrolled to the bottom of the message chain and found a short, casual text from Thorne to Eleanor, a message that would forever be burned into his memory. He'll never know. We'll give him enough to keep him in his little corner, drawing his pictures. He'll be happy. He closed the laptop. The click of the lid shutting was a sound of absolute finality, the sound of a door closing on a life that no longer existed. He sat in the armchair in the oppressive darkness, the silence of the apartment a living thing around him. The city lights outside the window, once a source of comfort and inspiration, now seemed like the cold, distant eyes of a million indifferent strangers. But he did not feel despair. The pain was still there, a deep, tectonic ache, but it was no longer the dominant emotion. The autopsy was complete. He had seen the disease, traced its every path, and understood the cause of death. And with that understanding came a profound, chilling clarity. Eleanor had made one catastrophic, fatal error in her otherwise perfect plan. She had looked at him for 10 years and had never truly seen him. She mistook his kindness for weakness, his introversion for a lack of ambition, his passion for a cute hobby. She never once considered that the mind capable of creating intricate political systems for alien empires, of plotting multi-generational story arcs, of choreographing epic space battles, might also be capable of strategy. She had assumed the author was as simple as one of his characters, and she had fundamentally misread the protagonist of her own story. He reached into the pocket of his jeans, his fingers closing around the cool, smooth glass of his phone. He was not the grantor. He was not the naive creative. He was the author, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he was about to write an ending that no one, least of all his wife, would ever see coming. His face, illuminated by the phone's cold blue light, was no longer a mask of grief, but a calm, focused tableau of a man who was taking back control of his own narrative. He walked out of the apartment before the sun had fully risen, a ghost leaving a mausoleum. There was no dramatic exit, no slammed door, only the quiet, deliberate click of the deadbolt sliding into place for the final time. He didn't look back. The man who had lived there, the one who believed in shared futures and the sanctity of partnership, had died in that armchair the night before. This new man, the one who now stood on the cold Astoria sidewalk, was someone else entirely, a strategist, a survivor, a silent architect of consequence. In his hand he carried not his battered canvas backpack, the symbol of his humble station that Eleanor so despised, but a sleek, anonymous black leather briefcase. Inside, nestled against the hard drive containing the copies of her entire digital life, was his old sketchbook. It was a reminder of who he was, the creator, the world builder, the man whose imagination she had so fatally underestimated. The morning air was sharp and smelled of damp concrete and the promise of rain. He ignored the beckoning entrance to the subway, the familiar path of his old life, and instead walked to the corner, his posture erect, his gaze fixed and purposeful. He raised his hand, not with the hesitant uncertainty of a man unaccustomed to such things, but with the crisp authority of someone who expected to be obeyed. A yellow cab, its lights glowing like predatory eyes in the pre-dawn gloom, swerved immediately to the curb. He slid into the back seat, the worn vinyl cool against the expensive wool of his suit, and gave the driver an address in Midtown, a place of such staggering wealth and power that his old self would have been too intimidated to even walk past the lobby. He was no longer building worlds on paper. He was about to build a legal fortress in the real one, and he knew he would need the most ruthless architect he could find. The law offices of Julian Croft were not in a gleaming glass tower like Eleanor's firm. They were housed in a pre-war limestone building off Madison Avenue, a place that smelled of old money, leather-bound books, and a century of quiet, unshakable power. The air itself seemed heavier here, imbued with the gravity of fortunes protected and enemies discreetly dismantled. Ben was led not into a conference room, but into Croft's private study, a sanctuary of dark mahogany, Persian rugs, and walls lined with first editions of legal texts that looked more like ancient grimoires. Julian, a man Ben had known since college, was nothing like the ambitious, backslapping law student he remembered. He was older now, with silver at his temples and eyes that held the weary, penetrating gaze of a man who had stared into the abyss of human greed and had never once blinked. He sat behind a massive oak desk, a battlefield where corporate empires had been saved and sundered, and listened without interruption as Ben laid out the entire story. Ben's voice was steady, devoid of the grief and hysteria that had consumed him just hours before. He spoke with the detached precision of a witness describing a crime scene, presenting the facts, the timeline, the evidence on the hard drive, and the full, breathtaking scope of Eleanor's betrayal. Instead, a slow, dangerous smile spread across his face, the smile of a master craftsman admiring a complex and beautiful problem. "She thinks you're an artist," Julian said, his voice a low, gravelly hum. "She thinks you create fictions. What she failed to realize, Ben, is that the best fiction writers are masters of structure, consequence, and poetic justice. This isn't just a divorce filing. This is a work of art. Her fraud is so blatant, her breach of fiduciary duty so absolute. We're not just going to protect your assets. We're going to salt the earth where her career used to be." From Julian Croft's office, a single encrypted phone call was made. It was a summons, and within the hour, Ben was sitting in an environment even more alien than the lawyer's study. The private wealth management division of a Swiss bank whose name was only ever spoken in hushed whispers. The office was on the 50th floor of a building that scraped the clouds, a minimalist cathedral of white marble, glass, and unnerving silence. There were no tellers, no lines, only a serene receptionist who guided him to a private room overlooking Central Park. The view itself, a declaration of unimaginable financial power. The man who entered was not a banker in the traditional sense. He was a curator of fortunes, a consigliere to the global elite. His name was Mr. Sterling, and his suit was so exquisitely tailored it seemed to have been woven directly onto his body. He listened intently as Julian, on speakerphone, provided the sanitized, legal framework of the situation. A client was about to receive a significant, unexpected capital influx from an intellectual property deal and required immediate, comprehensive asset protection and corporate structuring. Ben, following Julian's earlier coaching, said very little. He simply slid the hard drive across the polished, mile-long table. Mr. Sterling inserted it into a port on his console, his eyes scanning the data Ben had meticulously organized into a single, password-protected file labeled Project Compass. He saw the draft agreement from Thorne, the $75 million figure, and the fraudulent architecture of Eleanor's North Star Holdings LLC. He showed no surprise, his expression as impassive as the marble walls around him. He simply absorbed the information, his mind, a complex financial supercomputer, already running the calculations. "The structure she proposed is amateur," Sterling said, the word dripping with the quiet disdain of a grandmaster watching a novice play checkers. "A simple Delaware LLC, predictable, traceable. We can do better." He began to speak a new language, a lexicon of power that Ben had only ever read about. Offshore accounts, multi-layered trusts, ironclad NDAs, and holding companies registered in jurisdictions so obscure they sounded like locations from one of his own novels. He was no longer just Ben Carver, the artist. He was a client, and his first instruction was to build a fortress of impenetrable legal fire. The next 48 hours were a blur of calculated action, a masterclass in the silent, swift maneuvering of power. While Eleanor went about her days, radiating the smug confidence of a predator closing in on its prey, Ben was systematically dismantling her future and building his own. He moved out of the apartment and into a suite at a discreet residential-style hotel, a neutral ground from which he could direct his campaign. From there, guided by Julian and Mr. Sterling, he became a ghost in the machine, his signature transmitted digitally, creating a web of legal and financial entities that would be his shield and his sword. He signed the documents to form Crimson Compass Productions LLC, a Nevada-based corporation with an address that was nothing more than a mailbox, yet it was more legally sound than the entirety of Eleanor's scheme. He signed a power of attorney, giving Julian the authority to act on his behalf, a move that would prove critical. He spent hours on the phone with forensic accountants, who marveled at the clarity of the evidence he had gathered, confirming that Eleanor had not only planned to defraud him, but had also used her firm's resources, and therefore, technically, their shared marital assets, to finance the affair that was instrumental to the deal. It was a tangled, beautiful mess of corporate malfeasance and personal betrayal, and Julian was preparing to pull every single thread until her entire life unraveled. But through it all, Ben had one more crucial role to play, the part of the naive, unsuspecting artist. He sat at the hotel desk, the New York skyline a glittering backdrop of ambition and deceit, and composed the most important piece of fiction he had ever written. It was an email to Marcus Thorne, a carefully crafted performance of humble, awestruck gratitude. He wrote of his excitement, his slight bewilderment at all the business stuff, and mentioned casually that Eleanor, who's so much better at this than I am, was helping him get everything in order for the signing. He was dangling the bait, reinforcing the caricature they had created of him, lulling them into a state of absolute, arrogant certainty. He read the email one last time, a cold smile touching his lips, and pressed send, knowing the message would be forwarded to Eleanor within minutes, sealing her belief that the trap was hers, and not the one she was about to walk into. The final piece of the plan required him to do the one thing he wanted to avoid more than anything: return to the scene of the crime. He needed to go back to the apartment. Julian had insisted it was necessary, not just to retrieve his most essential personal belongings, but for one final, symbolic act. He timed it perfectly, waiting for the Wednesday afternoon when he knew Eleanor had a standing weekly partners meeting that lasted for hours. He let himself in with his key, the sound of the lock turning now feeling like a violation. The apartment was exactly as he had left it, but it no longer felt like home. It was a museum of a dead marriage, every object a relic of a life built on a foundation of lies. The air was thick with the faint, lingering scent of her perfume, a scent that now made his stomach clench. He moved with quiet efficiency, a wraith on a mission. He went to his corner, his creative sanctuary, and carefully packed his drawing tablet, his pens, and the original ink-stained pages of the Crimson Compass. He was reclaiming his tools, his very identity. He packed a single box of clothes and books, leaving behind everything else, all the shared furniture and art that now felt tainted by her deception. His last stop was the living room bookshelf. There it was, the hardcover first edition, his heart's offering, still pinned to the bottom shelf by the weight of The Economist. He lifted the magazine, its glossy cover cool and impersonal, and gently picked up his book. He ran his thumb over the inscription, "For Eleanor, my true north in every universe." The words now a monument to his own spectacular blindness. He didn't feel sadness, only a cold, clarifying resolve. He slipped the book into his briefcase, where it rested alongside a freshly printed, razor-sharp document from Julian's office, the divorce petition, citing adultery and attempted financial fraud. He walked to the door, took one last look at the sterile, curated space that had been his cage, and walked out without a second thought, the weight of the book in one hand and the petition in the other feeling perfectly, terribly balanced. The knock on his hotel room door was not a surprise, but a cue. Ben had been sitting in the sterile armchair, staring at the impersonal art on the wall, a gray and beige abstract that perfectly captured the emotional vacuum of the last few days, and waiting for this exact moment. Julian had prepped him, walked him through the script, but no amount of rehearsal could fully steel him for the performance. He took a single, deep, centering breath, the kind he used to take before starting a particularly difficult drawing, and rose to his feet. He He felt the cheap synthetic fabric of the hotel carpet under his socks as he walked to the door. He paused, his hand hovering over the cold brass handle, and composed his face into a mask of weary, heartbroken confusion. This was the role of a lifetime, and the audience was a single, ruthless critic. He opened the door. Eleanor stood there, a vision of corporate warfare. She wore a charcoal gray suit with shoulders so sharp they looked like they could cut glass. Her hair pulled back into a severe, immaculate chignon. He could see the faint curl of her lip, a silent judgment on the generic furniture, and the lingering smell of room service coffee. She carried a slim, black leather portfolio that looked more like a weapon than an accessory. "Ben," she said, her voice a carefully modulated instrument of pity and resolve. "Can I come in? We need to finalize some things." She believed she was here to witness a surrender, but he knew she was attending the grand premiere of her own destruction. She sat on the edge of the stiff hotel sofa, her posture a perfect, straight-backed declaration of superiority, and opened the portfolio. The interior was lined with a soft, suede-like material, from which she produced two neatly bound documents. She laid them side by side on the coffee table, a matched set of daggers. "I know this is difficult," she began, her tone the one a doctor uses to deliver a terminal diagnosis, full of practiced, impersonal sympathy. "But it's for the best, for both of us. A clean break." Ben sank back into the armchair, letting his gaze fall upon the documents, feigning a dawning, horrified comprehension. He recognized them instantly from the copies on his hard drive. The first was a marital separation agreement, a brutal document that waived his rights to virtually all of their shared assets in exchange for her magnanimous offer not to pursue him for the debt of supporting him for the last decade. The second was the rights transfer agreement, the one that would officially move the entirety of the Crimson Compass universe into the cold, legal embrace of North Star Holdings LLC. He forced his eyes to scan the pages, to linger on the clauses he had already committed to memory. He let his finger trace the name of the shell company, a pathetic, wounded gesture for her benefit. He could feel her watching him, her patience a thin, brittle veneer over a deep well of triumphant condescension. "I had my firm draft these to make it as painless as possible," she continued, her voice a smooth, venomous lullaby. "The separation is straightforward, and the rights agreement. Ben, look at me." He slowly raised his head, his eyes a carefully crafted portrait of shattered trust. "This is a good thing. Marcus is going to make your work immortal. And this stipend," she tapped a manicured finger on the clause detailing the insulting $150 $1,000 annuity, "will give you the freedom to create without worrying about money ever again. You'll be taken care of." He felt the rage, a white-hot nova, threaten to burn through his carefully constructed facade. But he pushed it down, converting its energy into a believable, pathetic tremor in his hand. She gave him a sad, patient smile, the kind one gives a child who can't grasp a simple concept, and said, "I'm not taking it, Ben. I'm making it worth something." He held her gaze for a long moment, letting the silence stretch, filling it with the performance of a man whose world was crumbling. He allowed a single, hot tear to well in the corner of his eye, a glistening, perfect prop of his utter devastation. He watched it track a slow, deliberate path down his cheek, and he saw the flicker in her eyes, not of compassion, but of relief. The final emotional hurdle had been cleared. He was broken, just as she had expected, just as she had needed him to be. He lowered his head, a gesture of complete and total submission, and let out a soft, ragged sigh that he had practiced in the mirror that morning. "You're right," he whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "You've always been better at this stuff than me." He could almost feel the wave of satisfaction and vindication radiating from her. This was the moment she had been working towards, the final confirmation of her narrative. He was the naive artist, the emotional child, and she was the brilliant, pragmatic adult who had to clean up his messes and turn his little dreams into real, tangible profit. She pushed a pen across the table, a heavy, gold-nibbed fountain pen from her own collection. It was an instrument of power, a stark contrast to the simple, ink-stained tools he used to build his worlds. He picked it up, its weight feeling obscene and alien in his hand. He uncapped it and leaned over the documents, his shadow falling across the pages that were meant to be his undoing. He paused at the signature line, his hand hovering, and looked up at her one last time, his eyes pleading. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice a pathetic final appeal. "This is what you want?" Her expression hardened, the last vestiges of feigned sympathy evaporating. replaced by a brisk, businesslike finality. "It's what's necessary, Ben. Just sign." He bent his head and signed his name. The familiar loops and swirls of his signature, a deliberate, controlled act of war disguised as an act of surrender. He watched her gather the documents, her victory complete, never suspecting that the ink from his pen was not a signature of surrender, but the trigger for a bomb he had armed himself. She placed the signed documents back into the portfolio with the reverent care of a priest handling a holy relic. Her work was done. The asset was secured. He watched as the latches clicked shut, each sound a nail being hammered into the coffin of her career. She stood up, smoothing the front of her jacket, her entire demeanor shifting from one of strained patience to brisk, forward-moving efficiency. The transaction was complete, and she had no more use for the emotional fallout. "My assistant will be in touch to arrange for you to get the rest of your things from the apartment," she said, her voice cool and distant, already moving on to the logistical cleanup. "And a lawyer from the firm will reach out to you about the divorce proceedings. I suggest you get your own counsel, though I doubt there will be much to contest." The irony was so thick he could have choked on it. She walked to the door, her heels clicking against the floor with a sharp, decisive rhythm. She didn't look back. There was no final, parting glance, no hollow apology, no acknowledgement of the decade of their lives she had just liquidated. He was no longer a person to her. He was a problem that had been solved, a loose end that had been tied. He remained seated in the armchair, holding the pose of a broken man, until he heard the solid, definitive thud of the hotel room door closing. He listened to the sound of her footsteps growing fainter down the hallway, until they disappeared entirely, swallowed by the anonymous hum of the hotel. Only then did he move. The mask of grief and defeat dissolved, and his face settled into a new expression, one of cold, placid, absolute control. He rose from the chair, no longer slumped but standing tall, his posture imbued with a new, dangerous purpose. He walked to the window and looked down at the river of yellow cabs and black town cars flowing down the avenue below. She was down there somewhere, in one of those cars, clutching her portfolio, basking in the glow of her false victory. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumb moving swiftly across the screen, and sent a two-word text message to Julian Croft. It was the signal, the go code, the beginning of the end. "It's done." She took the bait. The boardroom was a monument to predatory capitalism, a glass box suspended 40 floors above Central Park, where the city below looked like a circuit board of infinite, exploitable possibilities. The air itself felt different here, filtered and chilled, smelling faintly of expensive leather and the ozone tang of immense, invisible power. Ben sat at the far end of a mahogany table so polished it felt like a dark, frozen lake, his reflection a distorted, humble ghost in its depths. He felt strangely calm, a quiet eye in the center of the hurricane he had summoned. Eleanor was in her element, a queen holding court. She moved with a liquid confidence, her voice a perfectly modulated instrument of charm and authority, as she schmoozed with the firm's senior partners, a collection of silver-haired men with predatory smiles and eyes that seemed to calculate his net worth, with a single, dismissive glance. She introduced him with a proprietary hand on his shoulder, her touch a brand of ownership. "And this, of course, is my husband, Ben, the creative genius behind it all." The words were delivered with a practiced, affectionate pride, a performance so flawless it was almost believable. The partners offered him limp, brief handshakes, their grips cool and dry, their smiles never quite reaching their eyes. He was a curiosity, a quaint piece of the puzzle, the simple-minded artist whose cute hobby was about to make them all obscenely wealthy. A junior associate, his face pale with nervous energy, wheeled in a cart laden with a silver bucket of champagne on ice and a collection of crystal flutes. The anticipation in the room was a palpable, living thing, a coiled spring of greed. Then, the heavy glass doors at the end of the room swung open. Marcus Thorne entered, not with the swagger of a Hollywood mogul, but with the quiet, intense gravity of a true creator. Eleanor's face lit up with a triumphant, possessory brilliance. She took a step forward, her hand outstretched, her smile a perfect crescent of victory. "Marcus," she purred, her voice dripping with intimacy and success. "So wonderful to see you again." Thorne's gaze, however, swept right past her, his eyes scanning the room for a single, specific target, dismissing her as if she were nothing more than a piece of the impeccably designed, brutally expensive furniture. His eyes locked with Ben's, and the entire gravitational field of the room seemed to shift, reorienting itself around the quiet man in the ill-fitting suit. Thorne walked directly toward him, his steps purposeful and sure, ignoring Eleanor's outstretched hand, which now hung in the air. A pathetic, unanswered question. He stopped in front of Ben, a warm, genuine smile spreading across his face, and extended his own hand. "Ben," he said, his voice resonating with a deep, profound respect that silenced the entire room. "It's an honor to finally meet the Master." The silence that followed Thorne's words was not merely an absence of sound. It was a physical presence, a crushing weight that pressed down on every person in the room. Ben could feel the collective intake of breath, the sudden, sharp cessation of all movement. He looked past Thorne's shoulder and saw Eleanor's face. It was a mask of perfect, crystalline shock, her triumphant smile frozen in place, beginning to crack and splinter at the edges like shattered glass. Her outstretched hand, once a symbol of her control, now looked weak and foolish, and she slowly, mechanically, let it fall to her side. The senior partners exchanged quick, hooded glances, their predatory instincts instantly replaced by a dawning, horrified confusion. The narrative they had been sold was disintegrating before their very eyes. Ben, maintaining his calm, reached down and unlatched his simple leather briefcase. The metallic clicks of the latches were like gunshots in the dead quiet. He didn't rush. He moved with the deliberate, patient precision of an artist inking a final, critical line. He withdrew a thick document, bound in a simple, professional blue cover, and placed it gently on the polished surface of the table. The document slid a few inches, its weight and substance a stark refutation of Eleanor's entire scheme. "This," Ben said, his voice steady and clear, carrying across the silent room, "is the finalized agreement between Crimson Compass Productions, LLC, and Thorne Pictures." He didn't need to elaborate. The name of his own, newly formed company was a declaration of war. Marcus Thorne, without a moment's hesitation, pulled a heavy, unadorned fountain pen from his jacket, uncapped it, and signed his name on the final page with a bold, decisive flourish. The scratch of the nib on the thick paper was the only sound. A sound of creation and, for Eleanor, of utter annihilation. Ben watched her, saw the last vestiges of color drain from her face, leaving behind a pale, waxy canvas of disbelief and terror. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, darted from the signed contract to her boss, whose expression had curdled from confusion into a mask of cold, calculating fury. The $75 million deal was real, but it had nothing to do with them. As Thorne capped his pen, Ben reached back into his briefcase, his movements unhurried, his purpose absolute. He pulled out a second, much slimmer document and slid it across the vast, empty expanse of the Mahogany Lake, a silent torpedo gliding through the water until it came to a soft, perfect stop directly in front of his wife. If you are enjoying this story of betrayal and calculated justice, please like this video. It helps us bring you more stories like this. Eleanor stared down at the document as if it were a venomous snake coiled on the table. Ben watched her eyes trace the stark, bold letters at the top of the page, the legal heading that signaled the end of their world. Petition for dissolution of marriage. He saw her breath catch in her throat, a tiny, strangled sound of a soul being ripped from its moorings. The blood that had drained from her face now returned in a violent, blotchy flush of humiliation across her neck and cheeks. Her perfectly manicured hands, which had rested so confidently on the table moments before, were now trembling, a fine, uncontrollable tremor that betrayed the complete collapse of her composure. She looked up at him, her eyes swimming with a frantic, desperate confusion, searching for an explanation, for a sign that this was all a terrible, elaborate mistake. But she found no comfort in his face. His expression was a calm, placid sea, revealing none of the turbulent rage that had carried him to this moment. He leaned forward slightly, just enough to ensure his voice would be a clear, cutting instrument heard by everyone in the room, by the partners who had dismissed him and the boss she had so desperately tried to impress. "You said you needed his signature," Ben said, his voice devoid of heat, a simple statement of fact. He tapped a single finger on the $75 million contract that Thorne had just signed, the source of her triumph now, the monument to her failure. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he slid his finger across the polished wood and tapped the divorce petition resting in front of her. "But this one," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more devastating than a shout, "is for you." He let the words hang in the suffocating silence, allowing the full weight of their meaning to land. He held her gaze, watching the last flicker of defiance in her eyes die out, replaced by a raw, naked, and utterly pathetic despair. He stood, his chair making a soft scraping sound against the floor, and delivered the final killing blow. "You were right, Eleanor," he said, the words precise and cold. "My cute hobby finally came in handy. It showed me exactly who I married." By choosing to prioritize a life of integrity over one of deceit, Ben demonstrates that true wealth lies not in financial statements, but in the strength of one's character. The most valuable assets we can possess are self-respect and the courage to stand by our own creations. What do you think is the most satisfying part of seeing arrogance meet its downfall? Share your thoughts in the comments below. 6 months later, the air didn't smell like India ink and stale tea, nor did it carry the oppressive chemical scent of Eleanor's ambition. It smelled of damp earth after a rainstorm, of cedar wood from the exposed beams above his head, and the rich, nutty aroma of freshly brewed coffee from a simple ceramic mug that was warm in his hands. Ben's new world was a converted barn in the Hudson Valley, a space of soaring ceilings and cathedral-like windows that looked out onto a sea of green. His desk was a massive slab of reclaimed oak, large enough to hold not just his drawing tablet and pens, but the sprawling storyboards and concept art for the first Crimson Compass film. He was no longer confined to a 5x5 corner. He had a universe. The distant rumble of the end train had been replaced by the rhythmic drumming of a woodpecker and the whisper of wind through 100-year-old pine trees. He had bought the property with a fraction of the initial payment from Thorne, not as a display of wealth, but as an investment in silence, in the kind of profound peace that allowed creativity to breathe. His days were a quiet rhythm of work and collaboration. Marcus Thorne, no longer a reclusive legend but a frequent visitor and a genuine friend, would sit for hours in the worn leather armchair by the fireplace, the two of them debating the precise shade of an alien sky or the moral complexities of a minor character. It was a partnership of equals, built on a foundation of mutual, unadulterated respect for the story. The validation he had once craved from a single anonymous fan was now the bedrock of his daily existence. One crisp autumn morning, an email arrived from Julian Croft. The subject line was a single, stark word: update. Attached was a link to a legal trade publication. Ben clicked it, his heart giving a single hard thud against his ribs. The article was short, brutal, and professionally merciless. Eleanor had been disbarred. The ethics committee had found her guilty of a litany of charges, with the attempted fraud against her own husband being the most damning. Her firm, in a desperate act of self-preservation, had not only fired her, but had also filed a multi-million-dollar civil suit against her for breach of fiduciary duty and misuse of company resources. The affair with Thorne, financed on the company dime, had been the final, unforgivable nail in her coffin. She had built an empire on a foundation of lies, and he now understood that his signature had not been an act of war, but a simple, inevitable act of gravity. He closed the laptop and walked to the great window that framed the valley, watching as the afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the landscape. The news of Eleanor's complete and utter ruin didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a closing chapter, the final, quiet page of a book he had been forced to read, but would never open again. He thought of the two documents on that hotel coffee table, the contract and the petition. One was about price, a staggering number that had changed the material circumstances of his life, but not the core of who he was. The other was about value, about the non-negotiable worth of his own soul. For a decade, he had allowed Eleanor's definition of success to infect his own. He had seen his meager income as a failing, his passion as a liability, his quiet nature as a weakness. He had accepted her valuation of him. That, he realized, was his true prison. Not the cramped apartment, but the mental cage he had allowed her to build around him. The $75 million was not the prize. It was merely a tool, a key that had unlocked a door he never would have had the courage to open on his own. The true prize was this silence, this light, this profound, unshakable knowledge of his own worth, independent of any royalty check or box office receipt. He reached for the hardcover of The Crimson Compass, which now sat in a place of honor on his desk. He ran his fingers over the inscription he had written all those years ago: "For Eleanor, my true north, in every universe." It was no longer a declaration of love, but a historical marker, a reminder of a man who had navigated by a false star for far too long. He had found his own true north now, not in another person, but within the boundless, resilient universe of his own creation. He had learned that a person's price is what someone else is willing to pay for them, but their value is what they refuse to sell at any cost.